He stood frozen, his hand trembling above the document that could end his life. Behind him, footsteps echoed, slow, heavy, unmistakable. He knew that if he signed this order, he would become part of a machine he no longer believed in. If he refused, the man approaching would destroy him. This is the forgotten story of the officer who dared to say no in the one place where defiance meant death. The year was 1938, and Major General Hans Oster sat in his office at the Abwehr headquarters on Tirpitz-Ufer in Berlin. The Abwehr was Germany's military intelligence service, and Oster served as its chief of staff under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. Outside his window, the city buzzed with excitement over Hitler's recent annexation of Austria. Crowds had cheered. Newspapers proclaimed the Führer's genius. But Oster saw something else entirely. He saw the beginning of a catastrophe that would consume millions. Hans Oster was not the kind of man history typically remembers. He wore no SS uniform with its death's head insignia. He gave no fiery speeches. He never stood on a balcony before adoring masses. Yet in the shadows of the Third Reich, this Saxon-born officer would become one of the most dangerous men to Hitler's regime. Not because of what he built, but because of what he tried to tear down. Born in Dresden in 1887, Oster came from a Protestant pastor's family. His father instilled in him a strong sense of moral duty and religious conviction. These values would later clash violently with the regime he found himself serving. Oster joined the Imperial German Army in 1907 and served with distinction during World War I. Like many officers of his generation, he was shaped by the chaos of the Weimar Republic and the humiliation of Versailles. When the Nazi Party came to power in 1933, Oster initially saw them as a necessary force to restore German strength and order. But disillusionment came quickly. In 1934, during the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler ordered the murder of Ernst Röhm and other SA leaders, along with numerous political opponents. The German military stood by and did nothing. Oster watched in horror as his fellow officers accepted this massacre without protest. The military, he realized, had surrendered its honor to a gang of thugs. From that moment, Hans Oster began his transformation from loyal officer to conspirator. His position in the Abwehr gave Oster access to information that few others possessed. He knew the truth about the regime's brutality. He received reports about the treatment of Jews, the persecution of political prisoners, and the regime's preparations for war. Most importantly, he could see Hitler's strategic planning, and he understood that the Führer's ambitions would lead Germany to destruction. In 1938, as Hitler prepared to invade Czechoslovakia, Oster made contact with opposition circles within the military. He was not alone in his concerns. General Ludwig Beck, chief of the Army General Staff, had already concluded that Hitler's war plans were reckless and would lead to disaster. Beck tried to organize the generals to resist Hitler's orders, but most of them wavered. They worried about their oaths of loyalty. They feared being branded as traitors. They convinced themselves that Hitler knew what he was doing. Oster had no such illusions. Together with Beck and a small circle of conspirators, he began planning something extraordinary, a military coup to remove Hitler from power before he could plunge Germany into war. The plan was relatively straightforward. When Hitler gave the order to invade Czechoslovakia, the conspirators would arrest him and put him on trial for leading Germany toward catastrophe. General Erwin von Witzleben, commander of the Berlin military district, agreed to provide the troops necessary to seize government buildings. Everything was ready. But on September 29, 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Édouard Daladier met with Hitler in Munich and agreed to let him take the Sudetenland without a fight. The Munich Agreement destroyed the conspiracy in an instant. There would be no invasion, no crisis, and no justification for a coup. Hitler had gotten what he wanted without firing a shot, and his prestige soared to new heights. The conspirators scattered, their plans in ruins. Many lost their nerve entirely. Beck resigned his position in disgust. But Oster did not give up. If anything, Munich confirmed his worst fears. The Western democracies would not stand up to Hitler, which meant the Führer would grow bolder. Oster knew that more aggression would follow, and with it, the war he dreaded. He began to do something almost unthinkable for a German officer. He started passing military secrets to foreign governments. In the autumn of 1939, as Hitler prepared to attack Poland, Oster made contact with the Dutch military attaché in Berlin, Major Gijsbertus Sass. The two men had become friends, and Sass trusted Oster's integrity. Oster told Sass exactly when the invasion of Poland would begin. He hoped that if the Western Allies knew Hitler's timetable, they might mobilize their forces and convince the Führer to back down. The strategy failed. Britain and France declared war on Germany after Poland was invaded, but they did little to help the Poles, who were crushed in a matter of weeks. The ease of the Polish victory emboldened Hitler. In the winter of 1939 and spring of 1940, he turned his attention westward. His generals presented him with plans to attack France through Belgium and the Netherlands. Oster was horrified, not only because the attack would expand the war, but because it would violate the neutrality of small nations that had done nothing to threaten Germany. His religious upbringing and his sense of military honor revolted against such naked aggression. Once again, Oster went to Major Sass. He gave the Dutch attaché detailed warnings about the planned German invasion, including multiple dates as Hitler postponed the attack again and again due to weather and other factors. Oster was taking an enormous risk. What he was doing met the legal definition of treason, sharing military secrets with a foreign power during wartime. If discovered, he would face execution. Yet Oster believed that his true loyalty was not to Hitler, but to Germany itself, and that Hitler's policies would destroy the nation he loved. The warnings Oster provided were accurate and specific. He told Sass that Germany would invade the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg simultaneously, and he gave the exact date of the attack more than 20 times as it was repeatedly postponed. Dutch intelligence received Oster's warnings and passed them to the Dutch government. But like the Allies before Munich, the Dutch could not quite believe that Germany would actually attack. When the invasion finally came on May 10, 1940, the Dutch were caught unprepared despite Oster's repeated warnings. Rotterdam was bombed into submission. The Netherlands surrendered in 5 days. Oster's warnings had failed to prevent the catastrophe, but his commitment to resistance only deepened. As Germany conquered France and stood triumphant across Western Europe, most Germans celebrated. The generals who had worried about Hitler's recklessness now scrambled to praise his genius. But Oster saw the victories as nothing more than steps toward ultimate disaster. Britain had not surrendered, and Oster knew that as long as Britain fought, the war would continue. He also suspected that Hitler would eventually turn east and attack the Soviet Union, creating a two-front war that Germany could not win. Within the Abwehr, Oster quietly built a network of like-minded officers. His boss, Admiral Canaris, shared many of his concerns, though Canaris was far more cautious and never committed himself fully to active resistance. Other members of Oster's circle included Hans von Dohnanyi, a lawyer and official in the Justice Ministry who documented Nazi crimes, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Protestant pastor who brought moral clarity and courage to the conspiracy. These men understood that they were risking everything, but they also believed that someone had to try to stop Hitler before he destroyed Germany completely. The resistance movement that Oster helped build operated on multiple levels. At the most basic level, the conspirators used their positions to sabotage Nazi policies where possible. Oster and Dohnanyi helped Jews escape from Germany by recruiting them as Abwehr agents and sending them abroad on fake intelligence missions. These operations, nicknamed Unternehmen 7 or Operation 7, saved dozens of lives. The Abwehr's intelligence work also gave the conspirators cover to make contact with foreign governments and explore the possibilities for a negotiated peace if Hitler were removed. But the ultimate goal was always assassination or overthrow. Throughout 1941 and 1942, various plots were discussed and planned. The conspirators understood that killing Hitler would be extremely difficult. The Führer was surrounded by security, his schedule was unpredictable, and he trusted almost no one. Moreover, many of the military officers who might have supported a coup were doing nothing wrong from a legal standpoint by the standards of military discipline. They were following orders from Germany's legally constituted government. To convince them to join a conspiracy required not just courage, but a fundamental reimagining of where their duty lay. Oster argued passionately that the military oath to Hitler was not sacred and could be broken when the orders being given were criminal. He pointed to Hitler's treatment of prisoners, the mass murders being carried out in the East, and the regime's contempt for international law. But many officers remained paralyzed by their sense of duty and their fear of chaos. They remembered the turmoil of the Weimar years and worried that removing Hitler might plunge Germany into civil war. The situation became even more complicated after June 1941, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa initially succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, with German armies driving deep into Soviet territory. But as Oster had feared, the invasion created a massive two-front war. When the United States entered the conflict in December 1941, Germany faced three great powers simultaneously. Oster knew that Germany had no hope of winning such a war, but he also knew that Hitler would never admit defeat or seek a negotiated settlement. The Führer would fight to the last German life and leave the nation in ruins. As the war dragged on, and Germany's strategic position deteriorated, Oster and his fellow conspirators worked to recruit younger officers who might be willing to act. One of these men was Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a decorated officer who had been horrified by what he witnessed during the Eastern Campaign. Stauffenberg brought energy, determination, and access to Hitler's military conferences. By 1943, he had become the operational leader of the assassination attempts, though Oster remained a key organizer and advisor in the background. But Hans Oster's luck was running out. In April 1943, the Gestapo arrested Hans von Dohnanyi on charges of currency violations related to Operation 7. The arrest was a disaster for the resistance. Dohnanyi had kept detailed files documenting Nazi crimes, and he was also deeply involved in the conspiracy. Under interrogation, there was a risk he might reveal names and plans. Oster worked frantically to protect his fellow conspirators and destroy evidence, but the Gestapo was closing in. On April 5, 1943, the Gestapo came for Oster himself. He was placed under house arrest and eventually removed from his position in the Abwehr. The official charges related to his involvement in helping Jews escape and other acts of sabotage, but the Gestapo suspected he was involved in something much larger. For more than a year, Oster remained under surveillance, unable to participate actively in the resistance, but also not yet arrested on the most serious charges. Meanwhile, the conspiracy continued without him. Stauffenberg and others prepared what would become the most famous attempt on Hitler's life, the plot of July 20, 1944. Stauffenberg placed a bomb in a briefcase at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. The explosion killed 4 men and wounded many others, but Hitler survived. The coup that was supposed to follow the assassination fell apart within hours. Stauffenberg and several other conspirators were shot that same night. Others were arrested in the following days and weeks. The failure of the July 20th plot unleashed a wave of terror. Hitler was furious that members of the officer corps had betrayed him. He ordered the Gestapo to investigate every possible connection to the conspiracy. Under torture, some of the arrested conspirators gave up names, including those who had been involved in earlier plots. Hans Oster's name came up again and again. On July 21, 1944, the day after the failed assassination, the Gestapo arrested Oster and took him to Gestapo headquarters on Prinz Albrechtstrasse in Berlin. He was interrogated repeatedly about his role in the resistance. The Gestapo already knew about his warnings to the Dutch before the 1940 invasion. They knew about Operation 7. They suspected his involvement in coup planning. But Oster gave them nothing. He protected his fellow conspirators as much as possible and accepted full responsibility for his own actions. In the months that followed, the Nazi regime conducted show trials of the July 20th conspirators. The trials were presided over by Roland Freisler, the fanatical president of the People's Court. Freisler screamed at defendants, humiliated them, and sentenced them to death with theatrical fury. Many of the condemned men were executed by hanging from meat hooks, their deaths filmed on Hitler's orders. But Oster was not among them, at least not yet. Hitler had decided that some conspirators were so dangerous that they should not be given even the mockery of a trial. They would simply be held until the Führer decided their fate. Oster was transferred to the Flossenbürg concentration camp in Bavaria. The conditions were brutal. He was kept in solitary confinement, given minimal food, and subjected to regular interrogations. Yet, according to other prisoners who survived, Oster maintained his dignity and his faith. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was imprisoned nearby, continued to hold religious services for fellow prisoners, even under the threat of death. By April 1945, the war was clearly lost. Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin from the east, while British and American armies advanced from the west. The Third Reich had only weeks left to exist. But Hitler was determined to take revenge on the men who had betrayed him. On April 5, 1945, just 1 month before Germany's surrender, Heinrich Himmler ordered the execution of several high-profile political prisoners, including Hans Oster. In the early morning of April 9, 1945, Oster was taken from his cell along with Admiral Canaris, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and several others. They were told that they had been sentenced to death by summary court-martial. The proceedings were a farce, lasting only minutes. One by one, the condemned men were led to the gallows. According to the camp doctor, who witnessed the executions, the prisoners faced death with extraordinary courage. They stripped to the waist as required, and each man climbed the gallows steps without hesitation. Hans Oster was hanged just after dawn on April 9, 1945. He was 57 years old. 3 weeks later, on April 30th, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The war that Oster had tried so desperately to prevent or shorten was finally over, but it had cost more than 60 million lives and left Europe in ruins. For decades after the war, Hans Oster remained largely forgotten. In West Germany, many people preferred not to think too deeply about resistance to the Nazis. Some viewed the conspirators as traitors who had stabbed Germany in the back during wartime. Others found the questions too painful. If these men had seen through Hitler's lies, why had so many others failed to do so? The existence of the resistance was an uncomfortable reminder of how many Germans had simply gone along with evil. Moreover, Oster's specific acts of providing intelligence to foreign governments made him controversial even among Germans who admired the July 20th plotters. Passing military secrets to the Dutch before the 1940 invasion looked like straightforward treason, even if his motives were noble. Many historians struggled with how to assess a man who violated the most basic rules of military conduct in order to serve what he believed was a higher law. The documents that might have clarified Oster's role and thinking were scattered or destroyed. The Gestapo seized many of the Abwehr files. Some records were lost in the chaos of Germany's defeat. Others were deliberately destroyed by survivors who feared they might implicate people who had helped the resistance. Without a clear documentary record, Oster remained a shadowy figure, known mainly to specialists. But slowly, his story began to emerge. Survivors like Fabian von Schlabrendorf and Hans Bernd Gisevius, who had been part of the conspiracy, wrote memoirs that described Oster's crucial role. Major Sass, the Dutch officer who had received Oster's warnings, testified about their relationship. Historians pieced together the evidence from Gestapo interrogation records, trial transcripts, and scattered personal papers. What emerged was the portrait of a man who acted from conviction rather than ambition. Oster sought no glory for himself. He understood that if the resistance succeeded, he would likely be remembered as a traitor rather than a hero. He knew that betraying military secrets violated every code he had been trained to uphold. Yet he did it anyway, because he believed that Hitler's regime represented something so fundamentally evil that normal rules no longer applied. Oster's religious faith played a crucial role in his decision-making. Unlike some of the other conspirators who acted primarily from political or military calculations, Oster saw the struggle against Hitler in moral and spiritual terms. He believed that Christians had a duty to resist tyranny and protect the innocent, even at the cost of their own lives. His friendship with Dietrich Bonhoeffer reinforced this conviction. Bonhoeffer, one of the great Christian theologians of the 20th century, had concluded that pacifism was not an adequate response to Hitler's evil. Sometimes, he argued, love of neighbor required violence against those who sought to destroy the innocent. The question of whether Oster was right to do what he did remains debated. From a strictly legal standpoint, his actions were clearly treasonous. He violated his oath, betrayed military secrets, and worked to overthrow Germany's legitimate government. But from a moral standpoint, the calculation looks different. The government he betrayed was a criminal regime engaged in mass murder on an unprecedented scale. The war he tried to prevent resulted in tens of millions of deaths. If there was any chance that his warnings might have shortened the conflict or prevented some of its horrors, did he not have a duty to act? These questions take on added weight because Oster's warnings were largely accurate. He correctly predicted the timing and nature of Germany's attacks. He correctly foresaw that Hitler's conquests would lead to a disastrous, wider war. He understood earlier than most that Germany could not win a conflict against the combined forces of the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States. If the Western Allies had taken his warnings more seriously, if they had mobilized faster or struck back harder in the war's early stages, perhaps the conflict might have ended sooner. But history does not deal in certainties, and we cannot know what might have happened if Oster's warnings had been heeded. What we do know is that he acted according to his conscience when millions of others did not. He risked everything to oppose a regime that he correctly identified as monstrous, and he paid for that choice with his life. In recent decades, Germany has begun to recognize the moral courage of resistors like Oster. Memorials have been erected. Streets have been named in their honor. The German government has officially rehabilitated many of the July 20th conspirators, acknowledging that their actions, though technically treasonous, were morally justified given the nature of the regime they opposed. Hans Oster's story matters because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about duty, loyalty, and conscience. It challenges the idea that following orders and obeying the law are always the right thing to do. It reminds us that there are times when the greatest loyalty to one's country requires opposition to its government. And it demonstrates that even in the darkest times, even in a totalitarian state where dissent means death, individuals can choose to resist. The document that Oster held in his trembling hand that day in 1938 was not the final test of his courage. That would come later, in prison, under torture, facing the gallows. But that moment crystallized the choice he would make again and again over the years that followed. He could be part of the machine, or he could fight it. He could go along, or he could resist. The cost of resistance would be everything. The reward would be nothing. No victory, no recognition, only the knowledge that he had tried. In the end, Hans Oster's legacy is not what he accomplished, but what he attempted. The coups did not succeed. The assassinations failed. Hitler was not stopped. But Oster and his fellow conspirators proved that not all Germans supported the Nazi regime, that not all officers followed Hitler blindly, and that even in the heart of darkness, there were those who held on to their humanity and their moral compass. They remind us that individuals matter, that choices matter, and that courage is always possible, even when success seems impossible. The forgotten Nazi who tried to stop Hitler did not change history, but he preserved something precious, proof that conscience can survive even in the most hostile environment, and that some things matter more than survival itself.